There's a really curious part of one of the 2012 New Hampshire primary debates where an audience member in New Hampshire gets up and asks Michelle Bachmann, would she come into the state and overturn their existing same-sex marriage policy? Obviously, New Hampshire had previously had civil unions, and in 2009 had formally legalized gay marriage in the state. And the state recognized it. And the audience member said, would you come into the state and overturn that legislation? And of course, Michelle Bachmann said, no, of course not. We would never dream of doing something like that. And John King says, well, that's very curious. Michelle Bachmann thinks that it should be a state-by-state solution. And then he sort of goes down the aisle and has everybody say whether or not they support a constitutional amendment or they support letting the states decide. And he comes back to Michelle Bachmann at the end of that, and Michelle Bachmann says, well, never mind, I support a constitutional amendment to ban same-sex marriage. So basically, I think Michelle Bachmann has this sort of instinctive conservative move of let's let smaller governments decide this key issue, and then she realizes, but wait, that's going to mean something that I disagree with is going to happen in some parts of the country, and then freaks out and changes her answer. I think that's really telling of where we are today as conservatives. We are willing to let small government do whatever they want. We're letting local governments, state governments, etc., do whatever they want as long as it agrees with our own personal preferences. But that's not the point of decentralization. It's not the point of subsidiarity. The point of these things is that there isn't a one-size-fits-all solution for a lot of problems. Take, for example, the issue of gun policy. Growing up in a small town in southwest Missouri, I understand that I have a very different view of what a firearm is, what a firearm is used for, than someone that grows up in inner city Baltimore or inner city Chicago. It's just radically different ways of looking at the same thing, and that's based on our life experiences. It's based on where we're from, and I think that the way to get laws that are more reflective of our own views and our own attitudes about these things is to adhere to the principle of subsidiarity. Subsidiarity is basically a principle that says we will always defer to the smallest possible unit within government, starting with the individual. And for me, as I'll say elsewhere, I think that gay marriage is something that should be left up to individuals. It should be left up to people to make the decision for themselves whether or not it's something that they want to have happen in their churches, in their own lives, etc. So that's the first level. And then if we realize that individuals are not effective at solving a particular problem, maybe the problem is gun policy, then we can say, well, localities are the next step up in dealing with this process. If localities are ineffective or incapable inherently of dealing with that, then we defer to state government. And it's sort of a different way of looking at each policy issue, because I think the way that even conservatives start today is by looking at what can the federal government do? Oh, the federal government's not very effective, so let's let the state government deal with it. And it's sort of the reverse of what I think true conservatism is supposed to mean. We should always have a presumption, and I think being conservative means having the presumption that individuals are best when left to their own devices to solve their own problems. And not just individuals, but also their families, their communities, their churches, their civic organizations, that those are great self-governing bodies, and that we should, anytime that it's possible, allow them to deal with issues. If we find out that they can't, then it starts to move up the chain until we find a solution that is actually effective. There are all sorts of things that the federal government should do out of necessity. Things like national defense and security. Obviously, for example, we found in the 1950s, 1960s that state governments and municipalities were horribly ineffective at dealing with rights, with desegregation, etc. And it's something that has to be taken at that point out of the hands of the state, and we have to say, look, we need a federal solution to this problem. But we start with the presumption that states, localities, individuals are the best means of addressing these problems, and then and only then once we realize that was ineffective, can we look to the federal government for a uniform solution? And that's a big part of what I think it means to be conservative.